The Keth had never lost a war. Not once. Not in 400 years of expansion across 11 star systems. Not against the Valori, who'd been fighting wars for 60,000 years before humanity learned to write. Not against the Vras Collective, whose fleet numbered in the thousands and whose admirals had trained their entire lives for exactly one purpose. Not against anyone. The Keth didn't fight wars the way other species fought them. They didn't rely on courage or morale, or that kind of desperate creative insanity that sometimes lets an underdog pull off the impossible. The Keth were a hive. Every drone in their fleet shared one distributed consciousness. Every firing solution was calculated by 10,000 minds at the same time. Their reaction time was so fast that by the time most biological crews even registered an attack had started, the Keth had already adapted, countered, and started exploiting whatever weakness opened up in the defender's response. You couldn't outthink them. You couldn't outshoot them. You couldn't outlast them. The Vela Compact had been trying for 3 years. They'd committed their finest admirals, their most advanced warships, their most experienced ground forces. They'd lost 200,000 soldiers, 47 capital ships, 7 colony worlds, which meant 7 million people. People whose names were now etched on a memorial wall in the Grand Chamber on Compact Prime. A wall that was getting very, very long. So here's where it starts. 18 months before this story begins, the Compact's War Council made the decision that no governing body in history had ever wanted to make. They sat in that chamber, surrounded by representatives of 340 species, and they voted to stop fighting, to pay the tribute, to see the outer rim, and just hope that was enough. Hope the Keth would stop there. The vote passed. The tribute was paid. The Keth stopped advancing. For about 8 months. Yeah, 8 months. Then a Keth survey fleet appeared in the Threshold system, and everyone on Compact Prime who'd voted for peace quietly began revising their personal survival plans. That was the situation when Earth submitted its application for observer status in the Vela Compact. And listen, a galactic civilization had just accepted it was going to lose. That's the backdrop here. That's the room. And it was into that room, that specific, suffocating 3 years of losing room, that a 54-year-old woman from Sao Paulo named Reyes Makemba stood up in the Grand Chamber and said 6 words that changed everything. She said, "We'll take the Keth contract." The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Now, keep that name in your head, Cythery Vaughn. She matters a lot in this story. Cythery was a Valori fire control officer seated in the observer gallery. She had this habit of measuring silences in political chambers. Her species processed time at a slightly higher resolution than most, and she'd learned that the length of a silence was usually more informative than whatever got said to end it. 6 seconds meant surprise. 8 meant genuine shock. 11? 11 meant the room was trying to figure out if it had heard correctly. Cythery leaned toward her adjutant and spoke quietly through her breathing membrane. "What is a JSOC?" Her adjutant pulled up a record, skimmed it, passed it to her with an expression Cythery hadn't seen on him in years. He was a veteran of 3 campaigns. He'd served under admirals who had eaten live ammunition as a morale demonstration. He wasn't someone who got unsettled easily. He looked unsettled now. The record described a Tier 1 Special Operations Unit of a human military. Classified operations across 14 conflict zones. A doctrine built around something called direct action and unconventional warfare. And a section on psychological operations that Cythery read twice, because she wasn't sure it meant what she thought it meant. Meanwhile, the human, Colonel Makemba, the record said, was still standing. She was a compact woman with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that made every room she stood in feel slightly smaller. She was waiting with what looked like perfect patience for someone to respond. The Valori senior delegate finally managed it. "Colonel Makemba, you're aware of the Keth's capabilities." "Yes, Ambassador. You're aware that the Compact's combined fleet, representing the military resources of 340 species, was unable to achieve a satisfactory engagement outcome." "I'm aware. And you believe that a human unit," he glanced at the observer file in front of him, "of approximately 150 soldiers, 142, Makemba said. We lost 8 in transit when the Kestrel took a microdebris strike. I've filed a replacement requisition, but the paperwork's still processing. And I love that, because while this delegate is trying to find the words to describe how impossible this is, she's correcting his head count, like it's a staffing issue. Another silence. For seconds this time, the delegate gathered himself. You believe that 142 soldiers can succeed where the full military capacity of the compact has failed. Makemba tilted her head slightly. Cythery would later learn that tilt meant something. It meant she was about to say something that sounded perfectly reasonable but contained a depth charge. I believe, she said, that you've been fighting the Keth the wrong way. I believe you've been fighting them the way they expect to be fought. And I believe that's the only reason you're losing. She paused. Give me 6 months and operational independence. If I fail, you've lost nothing you haven't already lost. If I succeed, she smiled, then we'll renegotiate the contract terms. So here's where it gets interesting. Cythery was assigned as the compact liaison to Makemba's unit 3 days later. She was told it was an honor, a chance to observe humanity's first military contribution to the compact up close, an opportunity to facilitate communication between 2 very different martial traditions. She reported for duty aboard the Vagrant Star, a frigate that had seen better decades, and found Gunnery Sergeant Tomas Castellano waiting for her at the airlock. Broad guy, unhurried, prosthetic left arm that was slightly too heavy. She could tell by the way he held it when he thought no one was watching, this barely perceptible compensation in his shoulder. He had kind eyes and the conversational style of someone who'd long ago stopped being surprised by anything. Liaison Vaughn, he said. Brick, good to have you aboard. Your name is Brick? Nickname. Long story. He turned and started walking, apparently confident she'd follow. Colonel's in the tactical bay. She'll want to meet you. Fair warning. She's going to offer you sunflower seeds. Eat them. It'll go smoother. Cythery filed that information alongside everything else she didn't yet understand about humans and followed him into the ship. The tactical bay was a medium-sized room dominated by a holographic display table showing the threshold system in uncomfortable detail. A young woman was seated at the far end, surrounded by more screens than Cythery had ever seen in one place, muttering to herself and occasionally laughing softly at something on one of the displays. Warrant Officer Ji-Yun Park. Electronic Warfare. Signals Intelligence. Formerly a graduate student in adversarial machine learning, whatever that meant, who'd joined the military because, and this is a direct quote, the Keth drone swarm is just a really interesting distributed systems attack surface. And honestly, Cythery would spend the next 6 months trying to decide if Park was the most dangerous human she'd ever met or simply the most enthusiastic one. She eventually concluded it was both. Colonel Makemba looked up from the display table when they entered. She was eating from a small bag of seeds, cracking them between her teeth with a rhythm that said long habit. She looked at Cythery the way a chess player looks at a board, measuring, cataloging, already 3 moves ahead. Liaison Vaughn. Welcome. She held out the bag. Sunflower seeds? Cythery took one. Ate it. It tasted like nothing in particular. Good, said Makemba, apparently satisfied. Pull up a chair. We have work to do. Now, the first thing Makemba did was spend 3 weeks doing nothing. Hang on. I know how that sounds. Just stay with me. Cythery wrote her first psychological concern report during week 2. The Keth were actively probing the threshold approaches. The relief fleet was regrouping 2 systems over. Every hour of delay was an hour of Keth consolidation, and the human colonel was spending her days reading actual physical documents printed and annotated by hand, and asking Cythery extremely detailed questions about Keth tactical history. Not strategy, not fleet deployments. Tactical history, specific engagements. What the Keth had done in the opening minutes of the Vela crossing. How their drone swarms had responded to the Thalary's flanking maneuver at Keth 7. Whether the Hive intelligence had ever demonstrated hesitation. Hesitation, Cythery said. The Keth don't hesitate. Everything hesitates, Makemba said. When you give it a problem, it doesn't have an answer for. and then she went back to her reading. Cythery filed the report. Concerns. Subject appears to be underestimating the operational timeline, displaying unusual academic focus for pre-combat preparation, unclear command methodology. Then Makemba called the unit together and started talking. And that's when Cythery started to understand why the Grand Chamber had voted yes.
So, think about this. Every other commander wanted ships and weapons. Makemba spent 3 weeks just reading and asking quiet questions. And Sistari, this experienced alien soldier, is starting to realize she has never seen anything like this before.
The briefing lasted 4 hours. Makemba laid out everything she'd found in 3 weeks of reading. The Keth's pattern recognition was perfect. They'd never encountered a situation they hadn't seen before. Not because every situation was the same, but because their distributed intelligence had cataloged enough variants that everything mapped to a known template. Their response time was superhuman. Their coordination was absolute. But every strength was also a constraint. The Keth's perfect pattern recognition meant they expected patterns. They expected enemies to behave rationally, to take cover when fired upon, to protect assets worth protecting, to retreat from unwinnable engagements. Their hive coordination meant their response to new information was consensus-based. A lone human brain can make a decision in a quarter of a second. The Keth's distributed network processed at extraordinary speed, but it still had to propagate across the swarm, which meant there was a window, small but real, between when the swarm perceived something and when it acted on it. How small? Brick asked. 0.6 to 0.9 seconds, Makemba said. Depends on swarm density and communication load. Brick nodded slowly. And you're going to win a war in 0.9 seconds. I'm going to win a war in several 100.9 seconds, she said. Add them up, it's enough. And personally, that line right there, that's the whole philosophy. That's everything. Cythery filed her second psychological concern report that night. But she also stayed up until the station's artificial dawn, rereading everything Makemba had cited, because she had the uncomfortable feeling that she'd just watched someone explain how to do the impossible, and it had almost sounded reasonable. Okay, so, the first engagement. A probe action near the threshold approach. A Keth patrol of 6 drone carriers running a standard sweep pattern. The Compact's doctrine called for avoidance of contact until the relief fleet was repositioned. Makemba called for immediate engagement. Cythery, on the bridge, watched the tactical display and tried to predict what the human was going to do. The Vagrant Star was faster than the drone carriers, but outgunned if they coordinated. Logical play. Run. Or, at extreme range, try to pick off one carrier before the swarm fully deployed, then run. What happened instead? The Vagrant Star accelerated, directly toward the patrol. Full burn. Cythery said, very calmly, that this was suicide. From a station 2 meters away, Brick said, equally calmly, the Colonel knows. Then what? They're going to spend about 0.8 seconds not believing we're actually doing this. He appeared to be eating seeds. How he'd gotten seeds on a military frigate in a combat approach Cythery never figured out. The Colonel needs 0.6. The Keth Patrol registered the Vagrant Star closing at attack speed. The swarm calculated. Options propagated through the distributed intelligence. Intercept vectors were computed for an enemy that was either making a catastrophic tactical error or executing a very sophisticated feint, and the distinction mattered enormously for the optimal response. So the swarm spent 0.8 seconds making certain. Jian Park spent those 0.8 seconds uploading a spoofed sensor package directly into the swarm's communication band. The package told the swarm the Vagrant Star had launched a spread of micro-torpedoes on a lateral vector, an attack that didn't exist. The swarm pivoted to intercept the phantom spread. The optimal intercept geometry took them 11 degrees off their prior position, which meant the Vagrant Star, still burning straight at them, was now outside the kill zone. The Keth recalculated, found the spoof, corrected. By then, the Vagrant Star had already passed through the patrol formation at close range. Its point defense system, running a targeting solution Jian had written herself, not optimal by any standard doctrine. designed instead to hit the specific sensor nodes on each carrier that the Keth used for close-range swarm coordination. The drone carriers couldn't coordinate at close range for approximately 40 seconds. The vagrant star was already gone. No, seriously. They just flew through the Keth patrol and came out the other side. Scythery sat on the bridge afterward and looked at the engagement record. 6 Keth drone carriers. 0 human casualties. 4 Keth carriers with degraded coordination capability that'd take about 6 hours to restore. It wasn't a victory by any traditional metric. Nothing had been destroyed, but the Keth had been made to look for 0.8 seconds in the wrong direction. She put the report she was drafting away and started a new document. Not an official report. Something else. She wrote at the top, field notes on unconventional cognition. Okay, fast forward a bit. They fought 4 more engagements over the next 6 weeks. Scythery was there for all of them, and none of them looked like what she understood warfare to be. In the second engagement, Makemba ordered her ground team to hold a choke point against the Keth advance by setting up a defensive line. And then, before the Keth reached optimal firing distance, the defensive line got up and walked away. Not ran. Walked. The Keth advance, which had been accelerating toward the calculated optimal breach point, found nothing and overextended by 200 meters before recalibrating. Those 200 meters put them in range of a weapons platform they hadn't cataloged, because Ji-Yun had been spoofing its thermal signature for 3 days. In the third engagement, Makemba surrendered a supply depot, just opened the doors and pulled her forces back. The Keth occupied it, spent 4 hours cataloging the contents. Supplies they found were useful, supplies they found were booby-trapped, and 1 shipping container that contained nothing but a handwritten note in 7 compact languages. Get this. The note said, "We know your response time is 0.8 seconds. We're working on 0.7. Makemba." OIT gets better. The Keth High Command, when this was reported to them, assigned their first dedicated analytical resource to studying the human unit. This had never happened before. The Keth had never needed to study an individual enemy commander. Not once in 400 years. Scythery found out through Ji-Yun's intercepts and went straight to Makemba, expecting concern. Makemba said, "Good. Good." Scythery said, "They're studying you. They're thinking about me," Makemba said. "That means they're spending computational resources on predicting my behavior instead of executing their standard advance. Every cycle they spend modeling what I'm going to do is a cycle they're not spending on something else." She paused. "Also, it means I'm in their heads. That's worth more than a depot. And if you ask me, that is the moment the war actually turned. Not a battle, not a destroyed ship, just Makemba, living rent-free in the most powerful military intelligence in the galaxy." Scythery wrote 4 pages that night. In the 4th engagement, Makemba did something Scythery still couldn't fully process 3 weeks later. She had Brick lead a fire team directly through what the Keth's own analysis said was an impassable debris field, the shattered remains of a compact destroyer from the early campaign, spread across 200 kilometers. The Keth's predictive model calculated a 94% casualty probability for any attempt to cross it, so they hadn't assigned patrol assets to cover it. Brick's team crossed it in 9 hours using handheld maneuvering packs, moving in complete communication silence, 0 electronic emissions of any kind. They came out the other side behind the Keth's secondary logistics depot, and they spent 40 minutes removing every power coupling from every fuel storage unit in the facility. No explosions, no alarms. They put the couplings in a bag, took them with them, and left a note. The note said, "Your depot has been temporarily inconvenienced. Castellano, GYSGT, USMC. I love these humans so much." The Keth recovered, replaced the couplings, resumed operations, but it took them 11 hours. And during those 11 hours, 3 compact freighters that everyone, including the Keth, thought were civilian medical transports slipped through the threshold approach, carrying components for a mass driver platform that Ji-Yun had spent 5 weeks arranging. When assembled, it'd give the incoming compact relief fleet a reason to actually commit to the engagement instead of hanging back and hoping. Now, let that sit for a second. For engagements, 0 human fatalities. No traditional victories. No destroyed Keth assets of any strategic value. And yet, the situation had changed. Completely. The Keth's logistics were disrupted. Their analytical resources were partially redirected. Their patrol patterns had shifted twice to account for a unit they couldn't predict. And somewhere in the Keth High Command's distributed decision-making process, something had happened that 4 centuries of unbroken victory had completely failed to prepare them for. They were uncertain, not afraid, not demoralized. The Keth didn't work that way. But a hive intelligence that ran on perfect pattern recognition had encountered a pattern it couldn't resolve, and some portion of its computational capacity was now permanently tied up on a problem it hadn't solved yet. Cythery wrote in her notes, "Humans don't win by being stronger. They win by being strange." The Keth can calculate the optimal response to any rational threat. But the optimal response to an irrational threat isn't a calculation. It's a guess. And the Keth don't guess. She underlined that last sentence 3 times. And then the Keth deployed the Yalathis. Oh boy, the Yalathis was a Keth command vessel, one of only 4 in their entire fleet. A city in space, 11 kilometers long, carrying the concentrated processing power of their highest-tier hive intelligence, 6,000 drone fighters, and enough firepower to end the conversation between any 2 star systems. It wasn't a warship in the traditional sense. It was a statement, a declaration that the Keth had finished being patient. It appeared in the Threshold system on day 43 of the campaign and took up a position between the Vagrant Star and the Compact Relief Fleet's approach vector. Cythery received the sensor reading, confirmed it twice, walked directly to Makemba's quarters, knocked, waited, knocked again. The door opened. Makemba was awake. She was always awake when the ship needed something. Cythery had started to think that was less a professional habit and more just a biological quirk. She was reading again. Physical book, actual paper, which she'd apparently brought from Earth, and which Cythery had never once seen her finish. Cythery showed her the sensor reading. Makemba looked at it for a long time. She put the book down, walked to her small porthole, looked at the stars for a moment. Then she said, "How long have we had the mass driver components?" 16 days assembled, Cythery said. 18 if you count the 16 is enough. Makemba turned. Get the team. Full briefing in 20 minutes. Tell Jian I need everything she has on Yalathis-class command vessels. Sensor profiles, communication architecture, the works. Colonel. Cythery hesitated. The Yalathis is an entirely different category of... I know. The relief fleet won't commit to a threshold approach with a command vessel blocking the vector. There's no tactical precedent for... I know. Makemba picked her sunflower seeds up off the nightstand. She looked at Cythery, and Cythery saw something in her face she'd seen once before, in the moment before the first engagement, when a Vagrant Star was accelerating toward a Keth patrol that should have killed them. Not calm exactly, something more specific. The particular expression of a person who's already run the calculation and is just waiting for the universe to catch up. Get the team, Makemba said again. And Vaughn, stop writing the concern reports. Start writing the other thing. Cythery blinked. You know about that? Brick told me. It's good work. She walked past her toward the corridor. I want you to get the ending right.
She knew about the general the whole time. Makemba wanted someone to record what her people were doing. And now the biggest threat in the story just arrived. 11 kilometers long. And her first question is about parts and timing. That calm, that focus. Unbelievable.
So here's the plan. And trust me, you're going to want to hear this. The briefing lasted 6 hours. Makemba laid out the situation without softening it. The Yalathis was sitting on the approach vector. The relief fleet, 43 compact ships, everything the War Council had scraped together, was holding at the Threshold system's outer marker, waiting for a clear path. Without a clear path, they weren't coming. The fleet's admiral, a 400-year-old Delori named Corvell who had more combat experience than any living being in the Compact, had made it clear he wouldn't commit to a contested approach against a command vessel without operational certainty. And Corvell, Makemba said, wasn't wrong. A contested approach against the Elothists would cost him half his fleet, probably the other half too. So the Elothists had to move, or at minimum, it had to be neutralized, just long enough. How long? Brick asked. For minutes, Makemba said. If the relief fleet commits at the outer marker and burns hard, for minutes is what they need to get past the Elothists' optimal intercept envelope. Once they're past it, the geometry changes. Corvell can handle the rest. For minutes against a command vessel, Brick said. Slightly less. 3 minutes, 45 seconds to be precise. What does 3 minutes, 45 seconds of neutralization look like against that thing? Makemba looked at Ji-Yun. Ji-Yun had been quiet for most of the briefing. And for her, quiet meant she'd been thinking with everything she had. Everyone had learned to treat that particular silence the same way you'd treat a very quiet engine, with attention. If I can get a package into the Elothists' sensor array, Ji-Yun said, not a spoof, a deep package, something that actually rewrites the priority filters on their proximity threat assessment. I can make the entire ship think it's about to be destroyed by something that doesn't exist. How long does that last? For Elothis class system? She looked at her screens. About 4 minutes before the error correction routines catch it. Maybe a little more if I build in secondary cascades. They'll scatter the drone swarm, Cythery said. She was following it now. If the ship believes it faces an immediate destruction-level threat, standard Keth doctrine is to scatter the swarm to a defensive sphere to intercept. Which means the swarm isn't blocking the approach vector, Makemba said. Which means the approach vector is clear, Cythery said slowly. For 3 minutes, 45 seconds, Makemba said. The room went quiet. How does Ji-Yun get the package into the Elothists' sensor array? Brick asked. It's 11 kilometers of the most heavily defended ship in the Keth fleet. She doesn't, Makemba said. Someone else does. She looked at the display table. The sensor array has physical maintenance ports. External. They exist because even the Keth need to serve as hardware. The ports are sealed and monitored, but they're not shielded. There's no reason to shield a physical access port, because getting to it requires either being a Keth maintenance drone or being insane enough to attempt an EVA approach on an active warship. Another silence. You got to EVA an active Keth command vessel, Brick said. It wasn't quite a question. Someone is, Makemba said. Someone who's good with a maneuvering pack, knows how to run silent, and can hold a data uplink for about 90 seconds while sitting on the hull of the most powerful warship in the sector. She looked at Brick. Brick looked at the display table. He looked at his prosthetic arm. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Makemba. What are my odds? I ran the numbers, she said. About 40% survival. And if someone else does it, about 15% success on the mission, which gives the relief fleet about a 15% chance of making the approach. And if I do it, 90% mission success. Given mission success, you got about a 40% chance of getting clear before the Elothis detects the access and responds. Brick was quiet for a moment. So my 40% is worth a lot more than someone else's 85%. Yes. He nodded slowly. The way he did when he was accepting something he didn't like. When 31 hours, Makemba said. Ji-Yun needs 20 to build the package. You need 6 to run the approach. That leaves 5 hours for error. Right? He pushed back from the table. I'm going to go sleep. Wake me in 8. He looked at Cythery on his way out and said, quietly, Write it well, yeah? Cythery didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, I will. And personally, that moment right there, that small quiet exchange, that's the bravest thing in this whole story. Not the EVA, not the battle, just a man accepting 40% odds, asking someone to remember it, and going to sleep. Cythery didn't sleep. She sat in her quarters and wrote, because it was the only thing she could do, because Brick had asked her to, and because she was starting to understand that bearing witness was its own form of service. She wrote about what she'd seen over 6 weeks. She wrote about humans, not the record book version, not the statistics, not the military history, the real version, the version that required you to watch them to understand. She wrote about a species that had looked at the universe and decided the correct response to being outmatched was not surrender and not denial. It was stubbornness so profound it had calcified into a philosophy. She wrote about how humans seemed to experience risk differently than any species she'd encountered, not as a threshold to avoid, but as a variable to manage, something to be fed into a calculation and weighed against outcomes. She wrote about the way they'd looked at the Keth, the most formidable military force in the known galaxy, and hadn't felt fear so much as professional interest. She wrote, "What I've come to understand is that humans don't have a higher tolerance for danger. What they have is a higher tolerance for the possibility of danger. They can hold the idea, I might die, in their mind at the same time as the idea, here is what I need to do, and proceed anyway." Every other species I know, including my own, experiences those two ideas as sequential. The first displaces the second until the danger is resolved or escaped. Humans experience them as parallel. I don't know if this is a cognitive adaptation or a cultural one. I'm not sure the distinction matters. She wrote, "What the Keth can't model isn't unpredictability. It's commitment. They can calculate every option a rational agent might choose. But they can't calculate an agent who has already chosen and is simply executing. Makemba doesn't decide in the moment. She decides far before the moment, and then she's just present while the moment happens. The Keth's 0.8-second window assumes a decision is still being made. Makemba's decisions are made weeks in advance. By the time the Keth are calculating their response, she's already left. She finished writing at the ship's false dawn, saved the document, then went to the tactical bay and watched Ji-Yun build her package, because watching Ji-Yun work was like watching someone compose music that only she could hear. 26 hours later, Brick suited up. The whole unit was in the hangar. Not for a ceremony. There were no ceremonies. They were there because they were a unit, and you don't let your sergeant walk to something like this without being present. Makemba was there. Ji-Yun was there, still holding her tablet, still checking her screens with the focus of someone who wouldn't stop until the moment it was no longer possible to check. Sithri was there. Brick ran a systems check on his suit, a stripped-down maneuvering rig. No weapons, no active sensors, nothing that'd produce a signature. Just a suit, a thruster pack, a data uplink cable, and a small device Ji-Yun had built that looked like a coin and contained 6 weeks of her best work. He tested the prosthetic arm, the heavy one, flexed it twice, checking the grip pressure. Makemba walked up and stood in front of him. She didn't give a speech. She looked at him the way you look at someone you've served with for years and trust completely. And she said, 9 hours from now, you're going to be sitting in the medical bay complaining about the food. The food is actually terrible, Brick said. I know. I'll file a requisition. He smiled. He sealed his helmet. The bay doors opened. Sithri watched the approach on sensors and wrote nothing for 3 hours. Brick crossed 200 kilometers of open space at minimal thruster output, just enough to close distance, slow enough to avoid detection. The Elathis filled the tactical display. 11 kilometers of the most concentrated military power in the sector. And somewhere out there in the dark, Brick was crossing toward it one small burst at a time. 63 meters. That's how close he had to get. 63 meters from the hull of an active Keth command vessel to the external maintenance port on the secondary sensor array. He reached it in 3 hours and 40 minutes. Sithri didn't breathe for the next 90 seconds.
He made it. He is sitting on the hull of the most powerful warship in the galaxy, alone, in silence. And now 90 seconds stand between success and everything falling apart. Sistari is watching the sensors, and she cannot even breathe. Neither can I.
The uplink established. Ji-Yun's package uploaded. The Elathis' sensor array received something it processed as a high-priority proximity alert. A spread of compact stealth missiles on an immediate collision vector. Something that didn't exist. Something Ji-Yun had built out of go signals and Keth error correction logic so perfectly calibrated that the ship's own diagnostic systems would confirm the threat before they could refute it. The swarm scattered. Makemba opened a channel to the relief fleet. Admiral Corvell, your window is open. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. There was a pause of about 2 seconds. Sithri imagined Corvell on his bridge. 400 years of experience running the same calculation she was running, arriving at the same conclusion. Then the relief fleet burned. 43 ships, all at once. Every engine at maximum output, burning directly for the threshold approach on a vector that took them past the Yolothis's current position, through the scattered drone swarm, still searching for a threat that didn't exist, into threshold space. 3 minutes and 38 seconds later, they were past the intercept envelope. The Yolothis's systems flagged the sensor alert as an anomaly. The drone swarm began to reconverge. The Keth High Command issued engagement orders. Corvel's fleet was already in threshold space. The geometry had changed. The Yolothis was now behind them, and an 11-kilometer warship that can't turn fast enough is an 11-kilometer problem for the enemy, not for you. Cythery was still watching the sensors when Ji-Yun said, very quietly, Brick's thruster pack is active. Getting off the hull of a Keth warship that had just detected a tampering event meant crossing 200 kilometers of space while the Keth figured out what had happened. Brick had one asset. He was small, silent, and already moving before they started looking. He made it 140 kilometers before a Keth patrol drone's secondary sweep flagged a thermal anomaly. The drone fired. Brick's suit took a partial hit on the right shoulder. His thruster pack was operational. He was operational. He was 60 kilometers from the Vagrant Star's recovery boat. He made 60 kilometers in 42 minutes using one functional thruster cluster and the arm that wasn't damaged. The recovery boat got him. He was in the medical bay 40 minutes later. Cythery walked in. He was propped up in a bunk, right shoulder wrapped, prosthetic arm sitting on the table beside him. The impact had cracked the mounting joint, and it was quicker to take it off. He looked at her. How's the food? She said, terrible, and sat down. The battle for Threshold lasted 11 hours. Cythery watched most of it from the Vagrant Star's bridge, feeding targeting data to Corvel's fleet. And she'd spend months afterward writing about what she saw. Not the tactics, she barely understood the tactics, but the shape of it. The way it felt to watch something that had been inevitable for 3 years become, suddenly, not inevitable. The Yolothis retreated 4 hours into the engagement. An 11-kilometer ship doesn't retreat gracefully. It takes time and space to turn something that large, and every moment of that turn was a moment Corvel's captains were using to impose costs. The Keth swarm fought brilliantly. They always fought brilliantly. But fighting brilliantly from a compromised position is still fighting from a compromised position. And Corvel had spent 4 centuries learning how to exploit compromised positions. The Keth lost 17 drone carriers and withdrew from threshold space. They did not return. Now here's the part that gets me. Cythery's formal report ran to 200 pages. It covered every engagement, every tactical decision, every measurable outcome. Exactly the kind of document the War Council needed. But she also wrote the other document. The one Brick had asked her to write well. She called it the dregs of Vela, the lorry phrase that roughly translated to the ones left at the bottom after the good wine is already gone. The remnant. The leftover. The things you didn't think were worth saving. She wasn't sure if it was complimentary. She decided that was the point. It wasn't a military analysis. It was a portrait. 142 human soldiers, 1 battered frigate, and 6 weeks in which they'd done what 340 species and 60,000 years of collective military experience had failed to do. Not by being better, by being strange and stubborn and human in ways the universe hadn't learned to account for. The book was published in 12 compact languages. It became the most widely read document in the compact in the 3 years following the threshold engagement. Cythery received letters from beings across 11-star systems who told her they'd read it and felt something they couldn't name, a recognition, maybe, or a kind of vertigo, the feeling of discovering that something they'd taken for granted about how the universe worked was a little less fixed than they'd thought. She read all the letters. She kept them in a folder she labeled, in her own handwriting, useful things that should have been obvious. And honestly, I'd read that folder. 6 months after Threshold, the Compact offered Colonel Reyes Makemba a commission in the Combined Forces, the first human to hold one. The ceremony was held in the Grand Chamber on Compact Prime, in front of 340 representatives, under a ceiling that the Lori had built 40,000 years ago, when the oldest members of their species had been young. Makemba stood in the middle of that chamber and received the commission and shook the senior delegate's hand, and then shook every hand that was offered. There were a lot of them. She was patient throughout. She'd apparently stopped eating sunflower seeds for the occasion. When the formal proceedings wrapped up and the chamber settled into the kind of loose diplomatic socializing that follows such events, Cythery found her near one of the windows, looking out at Compact Prime, a planet that had been civilized for longer than humanity had existed, covered in 100,000 years of accumulated sapient ambition. "What do you think?" Cythery asked. Makemba looked out the window for a moment. "I think," she said, "we're going to need a bigger unit." Cythery laughed. It surprised her. She wasn't someone who laughed easily, and she hadn't seen it coming. She looked at Makemba, who was almost smiling, and she thought about everything she'd written, everything she'd witnessed, the long math of an impossible problem solved by a species that hadn't known it was supposed to be impossible. "I think you're right," she said. Somewhere behind them, Brick was explaining to the Lori Admiral, who had personally requested an introduction, that yes, the prosthetic was standard issue now. No, the heavy model was his personal preference. Yes, he could explain why if the Admiral had about 20 minutes. Jian was in a corner with 3 compact scientists who'd heard about her drone swarm work, all of them producing the particular energy of people who've just realized they're standing next to someone who'd figure out a thing they've been working on for years. Outside the window, the city went on. The galaxy went on. And somewhere on Cythery's tablet, in a chapter she hadn't finished yet, was a sentence she'd been trying to get right for 6 months. She'd written it 14 times and deleted it 14 times because it never quite said what she meant. She tried it one more time, looking at Makemba's profile against the window. They're the dregs of Vela, the leftovers, the ones nobody expected. And if you are wise, if your species is wise, you'll learn what I have learned, that the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy isn't the species with the best weapons or the oldest doctrine or the fastest reflexes. It's the species that looks at a problem that cannot be solved, decides that cannot, is an interesting constraint rather than a stopping condition, and begins, with absolute patience, to work. She saved it. This time, she didn't delete it.
She saved it and did not delete it this time. That is the whole story in one moment. Humans did not win because of better ships. They won because they refused to stop. If this story moved you, leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe because we have more amazing stories coming soon. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.